European contacts with Africa and the primary focus on human traffic had many consequences. Trade links widened, with goods coming to Africa from Europe. Gold, ivory, pepper, gum, and ostrich feathers were among the African exports, although the major exporters were slaves. To promote this trade, European traders established their presence in Africa. European languages spread to a few coastal areas, partly in order to facilitate commerce. New crops, such as cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes, found their way to Africa from the Americas. The most important consequences were associated with the trade in slaves. The main calamity was the loss of population, as more than 13 million people were taken out of the continent. We will never know the number who died in Africa itself during wars, raiding, expeditions, nor the number who died on the sea on their way to the Americas. One estimate in the mid-19th century concluded that Africa's population would have doubled had the slave trade not occurred. Demographic changes varied from one region to another depending on where slaves were captured. In areas without strong, centralized political authorities, as in the case of small, weak societies in the middle belt between the coastal and savanna states, a high enough number of slaves was taken that population decline was noticeable. Where female captives were retained in Africa, as in Dahomey, they were able to minimize the population loss by producing more children. The experience of slavery was one of human suffering that is hard to describe. The wars that produced the captives sold into slavery were traumatizing. Then came the Middle Passage, when the slaves were transported across the sea. Stripped, dehumanized, and branded, they were packed into small spaces and fed contaminated food and water. Dysentery, smallpox, and measles were among the diseases that afflicted a huge number. Many did not make it. 1 out of 6 never survived the journey. Those who made arrived looking like skeletons. To use the words of a Jesuit priest who saw a group of slaves in Cartagena in Spanish America, he observed that they were completely naked and no shut up in a large court or enclosure. For as a rule, they are left to lie on the ground naked and without shelter. Buyers examined and auctioned them like cattle. Then came the experience on the plantations, where they were treated as property, regarded as no more than cattle. The slave trade contributed to the spread of racist stereotypes about Africans. In order to justify enslaving human beings and treating them as property, Europeans had to dehumanize them. Africans were presented as savages, and slavery was justified as an effort to rescue them from that savagery. When slavery ended, people of African descent in Europe and Africa continued to suffer racism for a long time. As the wretched of the earth, they experienced economic marginalization and exclusion from power. The importation of firearms in exchange for slaves had devastating consequences on society. While it enabled African states to build professional armies, withstand possible European invasions, and expand their territories, firearms encouraged wars, the destruction of villages and towns, and the making of more captives to be sold into slavery. In some cases, raiding expeditions were organized to obtain captives. The slave trade thus affected African politics by producing more ruin, more wars, and more captives. The slave trade affected the economy in many ways, especially in production. First, African lost labor, its most important economic and social asset. As each person departed, wealth was lost. Next, human labor was exchanged for manufactured products, an unequal exchange that added to the growth of America and Europe, but underdevelopment of Africa. The slave trade incorporated Africa into the network of international trade as a weak member. Between the 16th century and the first half of the 19th century, slaves dominated the commercial transactions between Europeans and Africans, decreasing the importance of the other commodities. Whereas Europe and the Americas grew prosperous from foreign trade and became economically developed by the time the slave trade ended, Africa moved in the opposite direction, toward underdevelopment, losing the benefits of foreign trade and productive goods and entangled in the devastation caused by slavery. Africa's economy lacked the means to transform itself in positive ways. The loss of productive power translated into reduced consumption and production of many commodities on the continent. Craftsmen and farmers, notably young people, left many parts of West and Central Africa with a devastating impact on the economy. The rulers that profited from the trade also contributed to the damaging the economy. They believed that the economy had to be oriented to the capture and sale of slaves. In addition, they used access to firearms to threaten weak groups and dominate poor farmers and artisans. The goods they received in exchange for slaves, essentially consumer goods and firearms, did not stimulate further development. Where political instability occurred, even if temporary, famine could follow. In West Africa's Middle Belt, the effect on agriculture, manufacturing, and trade were devastating. Unable to protect themselves from wars and slave raiding, many groups had to abandon their homes and search for new, secure places in mountains and remote areas. Production became highly unstable. Finally, the slave trade created the African diaspora, the extensive relocation of a people away from their homeland. Today, blacks can be found in the United States, the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. This diaspora was mainly created by the slave trade. In the 19th century, when the transatlantic slave trade ended, people of African origins constituted half of the population of Brazil and Venezuela, and also much of the population of the Caribbean islands. In all these places, blacks contributed substantially to the economic and industrialization as farmers, miners, artisans, and domestics. They resisted slavery wherever they could, even setting up their own autonomous states, such as Primaries in northeastern Brazil, which was created in 1605 and lasted for 100 years, and Haiti, which emerged from the 1791 revolution of blacks in Saint Domingue. In spite of great suffering and marginalization, African culture spread in this diaspora, as the slaves and the free successors kept alive many aspects of their old cultures or created new cultures that retained elements of what they had before. In language, economy, and politics, the impact of the people of the African descent is indelible. In Spanish America, people of African descent established a self-help association for members of the same neighborhood or religion, each with its own chiefs, to assist one another and even organize protests. In Brazil, African culture mixed with the cultures of the Portuguese and American Indians to create a new hybrid involving child-rearing practices, folk tales, food, samba music. In North Africa, blacks made many contributions to colonial society. On southern plantations, Africans maintained many aspects of their culture in such areas as song, cuisine, and folk tales. African languages influences the dialect of Geechee and the Gullah in South Carolina. Africans also introduced better techniques of growing cotton, indigo, and rice. The slave trade ended in the second half of the 19th century. The process that led to its abolition began much earlier. A combination of factors led to the demise of the slave trade. A greater need developed for tropical products to supply European industries, thereby making it profitable to leave Africans in Africa in order to produce. Slave rebellions were becoming common in some colonies, thereby creating insecurity. And liberal opposition to slavery was growing in Europe and the Americas as more and more people criticized the injustice and exploitation of slavery.